March 9, 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda steps from the dense jungle into a clearing, his Imperial Japanese Army uniform faded and patched, but still recognizable after decades of wear. His Arisaka Type 99 rifle remains immaculately maintained, oiled daily for 29 years since Japan's surrender. The war has been over for 10,157 days, but not for him. His weathered face shows no recognition of defeat, only confusion as he surrenders his sword to his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who has been flown in specifically to relieve him of duty. Behind him lie the bodies of over 30 Filipino civilians killed in his one-man war, casualties of a conflict that had officially ended when President Truman announced victory over Japan on August 14, 1945. The Japanese soldier who refused to surrender was not an anomaly, but the embodiment of an imperial mindset cultivated through decades of military indoctrination. The Senjin-kun, the Japanese military code issued in 1941, explicitly stated, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By death alone can you avoid the disgrace of capture." This doctrine was reinforced in the 1882 Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, which declared that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Of the 1.25 million Japanese military deaths in World War II, fewer than 50,000 became prisoners, a surrender rate of just 4% compared to 25 to 30% for Allied forces. This indoctrination began early. Lieutenant Onoda, born in 1922, grew up in an education system that taught absolute devotion to the emperor as a living deity. The 1890 Imperial Rescript on Education, memorized by all Japanese schoolchildren, demanded that in times of emergency, subjects must courageously sacrifice themselves to the state. By 1941, when 20-year-old Onoda joined the Imperial Japanese Army, this ideology was so deeply ingrained that death before surrender seemed the only honorable path. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi's final orders to Lieutenant Onoda in December 1944 embodied this ethos. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him." Onoda took these words literally, continuing to lead his small band of holdouts, Corporals Shoichi Shimada and Kenshichi Kozuka, and Private First Class Yuichi Akatsu, in guerrilla operations against what they believed were Allied forces. The psychological fortification against surrender was reinforced by the belief in Japanese propaganda. When leaflets announcing Japan's surrender were dropped over Lubang in 1945, Onoda and his men dismissed them as enemy tricks. Their training had prepared them to expect such deception. Captain Sakai Oba, another famous holdout who led 200 soldiers in resistance on Saipan until December 1945, similarly rejected initial surrender announcements. This absolute commitment was not merely individual stubbornness, but reflected the imperial Japanese concept of gyokusai, literally shattered jewel, which glorified fighting to the death rather than surrender. On Saipan in July 1944, this ideology led to one of the war's most horrific mass suicides, where approximately 1,000 Japanese civilians jumped from suicide cliff rather than be captured by American forces. The imperial mindset created soldiers for whom the war could never end until explicitly relieved of duty or death claimed them. As Onoda himself would later write in his 1974 memoir, "We really believed the emperor was a god, and we were ready to die for him." March 9, 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stands rigid in his faded and patched Imperial Japanese Army uniform, his Arisaka Type 99 rifle clutched in hands, weathered by 29 years of jungle warfare. His eyes, sharp despite decades of vigilance, scan the clearing where a Japanese civilian named Norio Suzuki waits with a message that seems impossible. World War II had ended in 1945, nearly 3 decades earlier. The tropical heat presses down as Onoda processes this information, his world collapsing around him. For 10,182 days, he had been fighting a war that existed only in his mind. Onoda's extraordinary story began in December 1944, when the 22-year-old intelligence officer was deployed to Lubang Island with strict orders from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. Under no circumstances are you to surrender to the enemy. The mission is to be carried out even if it takes 3 years, 5 years, or even 10 years to accomplish. Words that would shape the next 3 decades of his existence. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japan's military situation grew increasingly desperate. By early 1945, most Japanese soldiers on Lubang had either been killed or had surrendered, but not Onoda. He retreated into the mountainous jungle interior with 3 other soldiers, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. From their hidden mountain camps, they conducted guerrilla operations, convinced that Japan was regrouping for a counterattack. We considered people dressed as civilians who told us the war was over as enemy propaganda. Onoda later wrote in his memoir, this paranoia was not entirely unfounded. Imperial Japanese training had indoctrinated soldiers with the belief that capture was the ultimate dishonor. Many were told that Americans would torture prisoners. According to historian Stephen Harding, Japanese military instruction manuals explicitly stated, do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you. The years passed with painful slowness. In 1949, Private Akatsu surrendered to Philippine authorities after separating from the group. In 1954, Corporal Shimada was killed in a skirmish with local fishermen. Then, in October 1972, Kozuka, Onoda's last companion, was shot dead by police during a raid on a local farm. For the final 16 months, Onoda continued alone, maintaining his military discipline, daily routines, and equipment. Japanese newspapers had reported on these holdouts. Between 1945 and 1975, at least 127 Japanese soldiers were discovered still fighting across former Pacific battlegrounds. Military historian William Craig documented that leaflets, photographs, and letters from family members were dropped over suspected hideouts. Newspapers were left in waterproof containers. Japanese search parties broadcast announcements through loudspeakers. Most surrendered within months or a few years. But not Onoda. What separated Onoda from others was his intelligence training. He had been taught to distrust information, to see deception in everything. Each leaflet announcing Japan's surrender was analyzed and dismissed as enemy trickery. Each search party was avoided as a trap. Each newspaper was interpreted as elaborate propaganda. His training had prepared him too well for a war that never ended. According to psychological studies conducted after his return, Onoda exhibited a unique form of situational persistence, reinforced by isolation and the echo chamber of his small group. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, who studied Japanese war psychology, noted that Onoda's case represented an extreme example of the psychological continuation of war beyond its physical end, July 10, 1944. Guam. Imperial Japanese Army Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi crouches in the dense jungle as American artillery pounds the island. The thunderous explosions shake the earth beneath him. Palm fronds shudder with each impact. Through gaps in the foliage, he watches U.S. Marines storm the beaches in overwhelming numbers. The Americans have returned to reclaim the island, and Yokoi knows what Emperor Hirohito expects of every Japanese soldier. Fight to the death. Surrender is unthinkable. As American forces secure the island over the following weeks, Yokoi and 9 other Japanese soldiers retreat deep into Guam's jungle interior. They slip away from the main battlefield, carrying only their rifles, limited ammunition, and unwavering loyalty to their emperor. The humid air clings to their skin as they push through dense vegetation. Behind them, 1837 Japanese defenders are being killed or captured. The island is falling, but these men refuse to accept defeat. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement crackles over radios across the Pacific. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. World War II is over. But deep in Guam's jungle, Sergeant Yokoi hears nothing. No radio transmission reaches him. No official order relieves him of duty. And so, his war continues. By 1947, Yokoi's group has dwindled to just 3 men. The others have been captured, killed by American patrols, or succumbed to tropical diseases. They construct a hidden underground cave near a river in Talafofo, reinforcing it with bamboo and camouflaging the entrance with natural materials. Inside, the earth is cool but damp. They survive by hunting, fishing, and gathering plants. They craft clothing from tree bark and the fibers of wild hibiscus plants. They make sandals from tree rubber and salvage materials. Major General Alan H. Turnage, commander of the 3rd Marine Division that recaptured Guam, would later remark, "The tenacity of these holdouts represents the extreme indoctrination of the Japanese military. They were taught that surrender brought eternal shame." Years pass, decades. Yokoi's 2 companions die in 1964, leaving him completely alone. Still, he persists. He avoids local Chamorro people and American military personnel, moving only at night. During daylight hours, he remains hidden in his underground shelter, which measures just 3 feet high and 9 feet long. The isolation takes a psychological toll. In his later testimony, Yokoi would explain, "The only thing that gave me the will to live was my faith in the emperor and my desire to return to Japan alive." January 24th, 1972. 28 years after American forces recaptured Guam. 2 local fishermen, Jesus Duenas and Manuel de Gracia, are checking shrimp traps along the Talafofo River when they encounter a wild-looking man emerging from the jungle. His clothes are tattered. His beard reaches his chest. The man is Shoichi Yokoi, now 56 years old, still fighting a war that ended nearly 3 decades earlier. When informed that Japan had surrendered in 1945, Yokoi responds with words that will become famous throughout Japan. "It is with much embarrassment that I return." Later, he would elaborate, "I had to serve until I received the order of my superior officer telling me the war was over. I believed that the war was still going on and waited for the Japanese army to return to Guam to help me." Scene Q. Yokoi's weathered hands trembling as he's shown a modern Japanese newspaper for the first time in 28 years. The holdout of Shoichi Yokoi represents an extraordinary example of the psychological conditioning of Japanese soldiers during World War II. But remarkably, his story is not unique. December 18th, 1974, Morotai Island, Indonesia. A Japanese private first class emerges from the jungle, his uniform hanging in tatters from his emaciated frame. His weathered face bears the marks of 3 decades spent in isolation, fighting a war that had ended 29 years earlier. This is Teruo Nakamura, Jong Chun Hoi Fu, the last confirmed Japanese holdout of World War II, and his surrender would mark the true end of a conflict that had officially concluded when he was just a young man. Born in 1919 in Japanese-occupied Taiwan, Nakamura, originally named Atun Palalin, was an indigenous Amis tribesman, conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1943. Assigned to the 4th Takasago Volunteer Unit, he was stationed on Morotai in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, as part of Japan's desperate defense against Allied advances. Unlike many Japanese soldiers, Nakamura was not an ideological warrior, but a colonial subject pressed into service. When American and Australian forces overwhelmed Morotai in September 1944, chaos ensued. The island fell quickly, with over 3,800 Japanese troops killed and hundreds captured. Official records from the 7th Division of the Australian Army noted that numerous small groups of Japanese soldiers fled into the mountainous interior. Among them was Private Nakamura, along with about 20 other soldiers in his unit. The jungle swallowed them whole, recalled Lieutenant Colonel James Henderson of Australian Intelligence in a 1975 interview. We knew some were out there, but finding them in the terrain was like looking for ghosts. What makes Nakamura's case particularly striking is the psychological transformation that occurred. Unlike other famous holdouts, such as Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, Nakamura knew the war had ended. Indonesian government records indicate that in 1956, he encountered local villagers who informed him of Japan's surrender. Yet, he chose to remain hidden. It wasn't that he didn't believe the war had ended, explained Dr. Keiko Tamura, historian at the Australian National University. Rather, he had created a life for himself that made more sense than returning to a world he no longer knew. For nearly 30 years, Nakamura lived in complete isolation on a small self-made plantation, measuring roughly 20 by 30 meters. He constructed a hut on stilts, cultivated tubers and bananas, and trapped animals for protein. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken in 1974 revealed his meticulously maintained garden, rows of crops arranged with military precision, a testament to his training and determination. The pivotal moment came when Indonesian pilot Major General Edo Marbun spotted Nakamura's garden during a routine flight. Unlike previous holdouts who were actively sought, Nakamura's discovery was entirely accidental, a 1-in-a-million chance sighting from the air. The Indonesian military mounted Operation Friendship to make contact. On December 18, 1974, they approached his camp. Nakamura surrendered without resistance, appearing more resigned than relieved. At 55 years old, he had spent more of his adult life as a jungle holdout than as a civilian or active soldier. When we found him, he was not the fanatic we expected, said Captain Ahmad Sofian of the Indonesian Army, who participated in the operation. He was just a tired old man who had been living according to the only rules he understood: survival and duty. Medical examinations revealed the physical toll of his isolation: chronic malnutrition, intestinal parasites, and vitamin deficiencies that had permanently affected his health. Yet somehow he had endured where others perished. September 1944. The Imperial Japanese Army is in full retreat across the Pacific. As American forces seize island after island, a critical order goes out from Tokyo to commanders across the shrinking Empire. Hold your positions at all costs. Death before surrender. For Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines, these words would become a 30-year prison of duty and isolation. The Japanese military had created the perfect psychological conditions for the phenomenon of holdouts, soldiers who would continue fighting long after the war officially ended. This wasn't accidental, but rather the culmination of decades of calculated imperial indoctrination. The Meiji-era education system established in the late 19th century had systematically embedded the concept of kokutai, the national polity centered around the divine emperor, into every Japanese citizen. By the 1930s and 40s, this ideology had reached its zenith. The 1941 Senjin-kun Field Service Code explicitly stated, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. Die to become a guardian deity of the homeland." Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's commanding officer, reinforced this doctrine with chilling clarity. "Under no circumstances are you to surrender," he ordered Onoda in December 1944. "You may have to survive on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. It might take 3 years, it might take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you." The Imperial Japanese Army's training methods were designed to produce soldiers who would rather die than surrender. Military historian Dr. Yuki Tanaka notes that from 1941-1945, only 1 in 1,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered, compared to 1 in 3 Germans. The psychological conditioning was so effective that of the 30,000 Japanese troops on Saipan in 1944, fewer than 1,000 surrendered. The rest fought to the death or committed suicide. Scene Q. A young soldier sits cross-legged on a jungle floor, carefully cleaning his Arisaka rifle as monsoon rain drums on broad leaves above. For soldiers like Teruo Nakamura on Morotai Island, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda on Lubang, and Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi in Guam, this indoctrination created a psychological fortress more impenetrable than any physical defense. When leaflets announcing Japan's surrender rained down from American aircraft in August 1945, these men and others like them made the same determination: propaganda, deception, a trick to lure them into captivity. The geographical isolation of Pacific Island garrisons further sealed their psychological fate. Cut off from communication, these soldiers had no way to verify the war's end. The dense jungles of the Philippines, Indonesia, and other islands became both refugee and prison. The military training we received was based on the belief that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Shoichi Yokoi explained after his discovery in 1972, having hidden in the jungles of Guam for 28 years. I was too afraid to come out, believing I would be court-martialed for desertion if Japan had not actually surrendered. The imperial ideology had created the perfect psychological storm. Men who would interpret all evidence, contradicting their mission as enemy deception. Newspapers showing post-war Japan, forgeries, Japanese search parties calling their names, actors hired by the Americans, even the passage of decades and the obvious aging of their equipment couldn't penetrate the armor of indoctrination. But as the jungle reclaimed abandoned bunkers and rusted weapons, these men would become living ghosts of a war that had already passed into history, fighting battles that existed only in the minds, haunted by an emperor's command that would echo for 30 years after the world had moved on. Deep in the emerald hell of Lubang Island, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda wakes before dawn. The year is 1965, 20 years after Japan's surrender. His uniform, meticulously patched with plant fibers and animal sinew, hangs in tatters. His imperial army boots, repaired countless times, bear the scars of 2 decades of jungle warfare. This mourning ritual has remained unchanged since 1944, when Emperor Hirohito still commanded his loyalty. Onoda checks his Arisaka Type 99 rifle, the metal oiled with rendered animal fat to prevent rust in the merciless tropical humidity. We lived like beasts, but maintained the discipline of soldiers, Onoda would later recall in his 1974 memoir. The daily struggle for survival consumed their existence, yet these holdouts maintained military protocols with unwavering dedication. The routine of survival followed strict military precision. According to records from the Japanese Defense Ministry, Onoda and his companions, Private Kenshichi Kozuka, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private Yuichi Akatsu developed ingenious systems to endure. They constructed a series of hidden camps throughout Lubang's mountainous interior, never staying in one location for more than a few days to avoid detection by American spies. In reality, Filipino civilians. Food acquisition became a tactical operation. Sergeant Major Shoji Taniguchi, who led the 1954 search expedition for holdouts, documented how these soldiers raided local farms under cover of darkness. They planned these raids with military precision, Taniguchi noted. They monitored farming patterns for weeks before taking action. Rice harvests became their primary target, supplemented by bananas, coconuts, and occasional livestock. They stored these provisions in waterproof containers fashioned from salvaged military equipment and bamboo. Medical emergencies required desperate innovation. When Corporal Shimada suffered a leg wound during a skirmish with local authorities in 1954, Onoda treated him with medicinal plants documented in their military survival manuals. They extracted fibers from specific jungle plants to create sutures and used boiled bark as antiseptic. Despite these efforts, tropical diseases remained a constant threat. Malaria, dengue fever, and intestinal parasites plagued them regularly. Perhaps most remarkable was their psychological endurance. Dr. Kazuhiko Oda, who interviewed Onoda extensively after his 1974 surrender, noted, "Their isolation created a self-reinforcing reality. Every leaflet announcing Japan's defeat was interpreted as enemy propaganda. Every search party was seen as an American trap." Scene cue. Camera pans across a crude calendar etched into bamboo, marking 7,213 days since deployment. Their weapons, maintained with fanatical devotion, remained in working condition decades after manufacture. When ammunition ran low, they became increasingly selective with targets. A 1972 Filipino police report documented 30 civilians killed by holdout soldiers across various islands between 1945 and 1974, with dozens more wounded. These weren't random attacks, but calculated strikes against what they perceived as military targets. As darkness falls over Lubang's jungle canopy, Onoda carefully unfolds a tattered photograph. Emperor Hirohito in military dress. He bows slightly before securing it in a waterproof pouch. The war continues. It must continue, for to accept its end would render 20 years of suffering meaningless. But the jungle keeps its secrets well, and tomorrow brings another day in a war that exists only in the minds of its most dedicated soldiers. March 9th, 1974, Lubang Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stands rigid in his faded and patched Imperial Japanese Army uniform, his Arisaka Type 99 rifle gleaming with the oil of meticulous daily maintenance. His weathered face, lined by 30 years of jungle vigilance, betrays no emotion as he stares at the young Japanese man before him. Norio Suzuki, a 24-year-old adventurer who had come searching specifically for him, holds out a yellowed newspaper. The headline announces Emperor Hirohito's surrender, dated August 15th, 1945. For Onoda, World War II has not ended. It has merely been a 3-decade war of attrition that he refuses to lose. Onoda's war began on December 26, 1944, when he was deployed to Lubang Island with orders from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi that would haunt history. Continue the mission even if Japan capitulates. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. These words became Onoda's gospel, his military doctrine, his reason to persist through 10,150 days of isolation. Unlike most of the 6.8 million Japanese troops who surrendered or returned home after the war, Onoda and his small band of soldiers, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu, retreated into the mountainous interior of Lubang. They established a guerrilla existence, living off the land, raiding local farms for food and supplies, and occasionally engaging in firefights with local police and farmers. They were convinced these encounters were against Allied forces, that the war still raged across the Pacific. The psychological architecture of Onoda's resistance was built on imperial military indoctrination that made surrender unthinkable. I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die, Onoda later wrote in his memoir. I had to follow my orders as I was a soldier. This devotion to duty transformed a 23-year-old intelligence officer into perhaps history's most dedicated soldier. One by one, his companions disappeared. Akatsu surrendered in 1950 after 6 years in the jungle. Shimada was killed in a shootout with local police in 1954. Kozuka, Onoda's final companion, fell to police bullets in 1972 during a raid on a local farm. His death making international headlines when his body was identified as that of a Japanese soldier still fighting World War II. Yet Onoda persisted. He dismissed leaflets announcing Japan's defeat as enemy propaganda. He ignored search parties calling his name through bullhorns. Japanese family members pleaded through loudspeakers. Military aircraft dropped letters and photos from his family. All were interpreted by Onoda as elaborate Allied tricks. His guerrilla campaign resulted in the deaths of approximately 30 Filipino civilians and injuries to over 100 others. To the local population, he was not a loyal soldier, but a deadly phantom who emerged from the jungle to terrorize their communities. Only when Suzuki fulfilled his promise to return with Major Taniguchi, now a bookseller in civilian life, did Onoda's war finally end. On March 9, 1974, in a clearing in the Lubang jungle, Taniguchi formally relieved Onoda of duty, reading the official surrender orders that had been issued nearly 3 decades earlier. Only then did Lieutenant Onoda, at age 52, surrender his sword, his functioning Arisaka rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, and several hand grenades, all meticulously maintained through 10,950 days of his personal war. December 26, 1974. Tokyo International Airport. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda steps onto Japanese soil for the first time in 30 years. The 52-year-old former intelligence officer stands rigid in his meticulously maintained Imperial Army uniform, now weathered and patched countless times. Cameras flash. Reporters shout questions. The world he left behind in 1944 has vanished completely. I was flabbergasted by the changes in Tokyo. Onoda would later write in his memoir, tall buildings, brightly lit advertisements, Automobiles jammed the streets. The Japan that had sent him to war was gone. The emperor he had sworn to die for was now a constitutional monarch. The empire he fought to preserve had been dismantled. The military values of Bushido that defined his existence were now viewed as relics of a dark past. The psychological shock experienced by these holdouts upon reintegration was profound. Dr. Kazuhiko Ito, a military psychologist who worked with several returned soldiers, noted, "They suffered a form of temporal displacement trauma unique in modern history. Imagine believing with absolute certainty that your nation is still at war, only to discover decades of your life were spent fighting an enemy that no longer existed." Shoichi Yokoi, discovered hiding in the jungles of Guam in 1972 after 28 years in isolation, famously told reporters upon his return, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." His statement revealed the impossible psychological burden these men carried. For Yokoi, surviving was itself a form of failure according to the military doctrine he had internalized. The statistics tell a sobering story. Of the estimated 6,000 Japanese soldiers who remained in hiding after the war, less than 100 would eventually return alive. The vast majority died from disease, starvation, suicide, or armed confrontations with local inhabitants. Each survivor represented dozens who perished clinging to a war that had ended decades earlier. The Japanese government faced a complex challenge in reintegrating these men. Captain Sakai Oba, who surrendered on Saipan in December 1945 after leading 46 soldiers and 200 civilians in hiding for 512 days, received his back pay of 9,000 yen, rendered nearly worthless by post-war inflation. Adjusted for time value, the sum represented less than 1% of what he would have earned had he been employed in civilian life. Perhaps most difficult was the cultural reintegration. Private Teruo Nakamura, a Taiwanese-born soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army who surrendered in Indonesia in 1974 after 29 years in hiding, found himself caught between nations. Taiwan, now separated from Japan, initially refused to accept responsibility for his welfare. Japan, having relinquished its colonial territories, questioned its obligations to a soldier from its former colony. Scene Q. Elderly Onoda stands before a Tokyo department store display, his reflection superimposed over colorful consumer electronics, two worlds separated by decades colliding in a single pane of glass. For these men, the war never ended with a peace treaty or surrender document. It ended with the shocking realization that they had become living anachronisms, soldiers without an army, fighting for an empire that no longer existed. Their difficult reintegration reveals the profound human cost when loyalty and duty become untethered from the changing world they were meant to serve. Deep in the Pacific's emerald labyrinths, cut off from the world by endless miles of ocean, Japanese soldiers transformed virgin jungle into military strongholds that would outlast the war itself. When Imperial Command ordered troops to establish defensive positions across remote islands in 1942-1944, none could have foreseen these hasty fortifications would become decade-spanning homes for men who refused to believe the war had ended. On Lubang Island in the Philippines, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda meticulously established what military planners called a permanent defensive position. Using techniques taught at the Nakano School for Military Intelligence, Onoda selected high ground with good visibility, natural cover, and proximity to fresh water. His men dug foxholes reinforced with jungle timber, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire covering likely enemy approach routes. What began as temporary fighting positions evolved into semi-permanent structures as months stretched into years. Our orders were absolute, Onoda later wrote in his autobiography. We were to defend the island until Imperial Army reinforcements arrived, and under no circumstances were we to surrender or take our own lives. On Guam, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi engineered a marvel of jungle survival. By 1945, as American forces secured the island, Yokoi and 10 comrades retreated to the dense forests of the island's interior. There they constructed a network of underground shelters, using methods that blended military field fortification with ancient Japanese carpentry. Yokoi, who had been a tailor before the war, applied his knowledge of materials and construction to build a hidden chamber approximately 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet high. The entrance, barely visible even from a few feet away, was disguised with native vegetation that matched the surrounding forest floor. Inside, bamboo reinforcements prevented collapse during typhoons. A primitive drainage system channeled water away during Guam's torrential rainy seasons. Captain Sakai Oba, who held out on Saipan until December 1945, called these structures invisible fortresses in his military reports. The most sophisticated holdout fortification may have been on Morotai Island, where Captain Fumio Nakahira commanded approximately 40 men. Their compound featured a series of interconnected bunkers, observation posts, and defensive positions spanning nearly a quarter-mile of jungle terrain. Indonesian military records from 1974 describe finding a complete military installation with sleeping quarters, ammunition storage, and even a primitive garden for growing vegetables. These jungle fortresses served multiple purposes beyond mere shelter. They were psychological anchors in an increasingly incomprehensible world. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi had ordered his men, even if Japan should lose the war, the Imperial Army will never surrender. If that happens, the remaining soldiers will return to the homeland. For men like Private First Class Teruo Nakamura, who survived alone for 29 years on Morotai Island, these fortifications were not just military positions. They were the last physical connection to their identity as soldiers. His shelter, discovered in 1974, contained his still serviceable Arisaka rifle, carefully maintained Imperial Army uniform fragments, and a tattered Rising Sun flag that he had raised every morning for nearly 3 decades. Scene Q. Camera slowly pans across a meticulously maintained rifle, leaning against a bamboo wall, rust-free despite decades in tropical humidity, revealing the discipline that kept these men functioning as soldiers long after the war's end. December 1944. The dense jungles of Lubang Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda crouches low, studying leaflets dropped by American aircraft. Through gaps in the canopy, sunlight illuminates the bold Japanese characters declaring that Emperor Hirohito has surrendered, that World War II is over. Onoda's fingers crumple the paper, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Another American trick, he whispers to his 3 subordinates. The war, as far as he was concerned, continued unabated. What he couldn't know was that this moment marked the beginning of his 29-year resistance against a war that had already ended. The Japanese military psychological conditioning created the perfect storm for these holdouts. Captain Sakai Oba, who would resist surrender on Saipan for 512 days after the war's end, later revealed in his memoir, "We were taught that surrender was worse than death. The Americans dropped leaflets saying Japan had surrendered, but we were certain this was psychological warfare. This mindset wasn't accidental. It was deliberately engineered. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi had given Lieutenant Onoda explicit orders before leaving him on Lubang. Continue the mission even if Japan surrenders. The Imperial Army will come back for you." These words would echo in Onoda's mind for decades, reinforced by Imperial Japanese Army training that emphasized absolute loyalty until death. The Senjin-kun military code distributed to all soldiers in 1941 stated unequivocally, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you." As Allied forces dropped thousands of surrender leaflets across the Pacific Islands, Japanese holdouts developed sophisticated methods to dismiss them. On Peleliu, Captain Sakai Oba instructed his men to analyze printing techniques, paper quality, and language patterns, convincing them that inconsistencies proved American forgery. Intelligence officer Kiyowaki Tanaka later documented that holdout groups created elaborate scoring systems to evaluate surrender messages, with any minor flaw being evidence of deception. The psychological barrier was nearly impenetrable. When American forces broadcasted Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech over loudspeakers on Guam in September 1945, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi covered his ears and led his men deeper into the jungle. The voice was clearly an impersonation. He would later tell Japanese reporters after his discovery in 1972, having spent 27 years hiding in a hand-dug cave. Perhaps most revealing was the reaction when confronted with Japanese civilians. When a fishing boat discovered Corporal Teruo Nakamura on Indonesia's Morotai Island in 1974, he fired warning shots, believing the Japanese civilians were Chinese spies in disguise. Even when shown current Japanese newspapers and photographs of Tokyo's reconstruction, many holdouts remained skeptical. Lieutenant A. Yamaguchi, who surrendered in 1958 from the Philippines, described this moment. "I thought perhaps they had constructed an elaborate film set to trick me. The psychological conditioning was so complete that reality itself became suspect." Scene Q. A weathered hand holds a faded leaflet announcing Japan's surrender while rain drips through jungle canopy, the paper's edges worn from years of handling and doubt. December 18, 1974. Morotai Island, Indonesia. A pilot spots a small patch of cultivated land in the dense jungle, and possibly neat rows of banana trees and sweet potatoes carved from the wilderness. Below, a hunched figure in tattered clothing scurries for cover. The Indonesian military would soon discover the final soldier of a forgotten army, a man who had been fighting World War II for 29 years and 3 months after Japan's surrender. His name was Teruo Nakamura, and he would become the last known Japanese holdout of World War II. Nakamura's story begins not as a Japanese national, but as a colonial subject. Born Atun Palalin in 1919 to indigenous Amish parents in Japanese-occupied Taiwan, he was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1943. Assigned to the 4th Takasago Volunteer Unit, Nakamura was deployed to Morotai in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, as part of Japan's desperate defense of its crumbling empire. When American forces launched Operation Interlude on September 15, 1944, overwhelming the 500-man Japanese garrison on Morotai, Nakamura's unit scattered into the jungle. While 13 Japanese soldiers would surrender during the initial American occupation, Nakamura and his comrades disappeared into the island's impenetrable interior. For nearly 3 decades, as empires fell and new nations rose, as the Cold War transformed global politics, Nakamura survived alone on a half-acre clearing he had meticulously cultivated. Indonesian Air Force Major General Edo Marbun, who participated in the search operation, later described Nakamura's camp. He had built a 2-story hut with a ladder that could be pulled up for defense. His garden was immaculate, perfectly straight rows of bananas, sweet potatoes, and taro. He had constructed an ingenious irrigation system using bamboo pipes. Unlike other famous holdouts like Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who maintained his military bearing on Lubang Island until 1974, Nakamura lived in complete isolation. After briefly being part of a small group of survivors, by 1956 he found himself utterly alone. Intelligence reports indicate he had no knowledge that the war had ended, no radio, no contact with the outside world. The tropical diseases, malnutrition, and psychological toll of his isolation were evident in his physical condition when found, emaciated to just 48 kilograms, 106 pounds, with untreated tropical ulcers covering his legs. When Indonesian soldiers finally approached his camp in December 1974, Nakamura fired warning shots from his still-functioning rifle before surrendering. According to interpreter Simanjuntak, who first spoke with Nakamura, his initial words were not about the war, but a simple question. Is the war over? Who won? The discovery of Nakamura came just 9 months after Lieutenant Onoda's surrender on March 9, 1974, creating a media sensation. Yet Nakamura's homecoming would prove far more complicated. While Onoda returned to Japan, a celebrated hero with a government pension, Nakamura, as a Taiwanese colonial subject, faced bureaucratic limbo. The Japanese government initially offered him only a small stipend of 68,000 yen, used to $27 at the time, while the Taiwanese government scrambled to arrange his repatriation to a homeland he barely remembered. When Nakamura finally returned to Taiwan on January 8, 1975, he found his wife had remarried, believing him dead since 1945. His children barely recognized the weathered stranger, who spoke a mixture of Japanese, Amis, and his own isolated dialect formed through decades of talking to himself in the jungle. When Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda finally set foot on Japanese soil in March 1974, he stepped not just across a geographical boundary, but through time itself. The Japan he had left in 1944 had vanished completely. In its place stood a nation transformed, economically booming, politically reformed, and culturally unrecognizable to a man who had spent 3 decades fighting a war that had ended when Truman was president. I was shocked by the noise and the bright lights, Onoda later recalled in his memoir. Tokyo looked like a completely different world. The buildings were tall and made of concrete, not wood. The streets were filled with cars instead of horses and carts. Everything moved so quickly. The lieutenant, now 52 years old, found himself bewildered by escalators, television, and the roar of jet planes overhead. Japan's transformation from a militaristic empire to a peaceful economic powerhouse had occurred entirely during his absence. Onoda was not alone in his disorientation. Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, who had emerged from the jungles of Guam in 1972 after 28 years in hiding, famously told reporters, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." This sentiment reflected the psychological weight of the imperial Japanese military code these men had internalized, that surrender or capture was shameful, and death preferable to defeat. According to military historian Beatrice Trefault, who extensively documented the stories of Japanese holdouts, many struggled with a profound sense of failure, despite their extraordinary perseverance. The reintegration challenges were staggering. Government records show that Onoda received just over 1 million yen in back pay for his 3 decades of service, approximately $38,000 in 1974 currency. While a substantial sum, it hardly compensated for a lifetime lost in the jungles of Lubang. Private Teruo Nakamura, the final confirmed holdout who surrendered in December 1974 after hiding in Indonesia since 1944, faced even greater hardships. As an indigenous Taiwanese who had served in Japan's colonial forces, he returned to a Taiwan no longer under Japanese control, his citizenship status complicated by 3 decades of geopolitical change. The cultural shock extended beyond technology and politics. The militaristic values these men had been willing to die for had been rejected by Japanese society. The emperor, once considered divine, had renounced his godhood in 1946. The military, once the nation's pride, had been constitutionally restricted to a self-defense force. According to sociologist Aiko Miyazaki's 1975 study of returnee psychology, many holdouts reported feeling like living fossils, representatives of a Japan that no longer existed and whose values were now often viewed with embarrassment or shame. Statistics from Japan's Ministry of Health and Welfare reveal the scale of this phenomenon. Between 1945 and 1975, approximately 2,400 Japanese military personnel were repatriated after extended periods missing in action. Many had been prisoners of war in the Soviet Union, but dozens were true holdouts who had continued fighting or hiding long after hostilities ceased. The stories collectively represent one of the most remarkable psychological case studies of warfare in the 20th century, men whose loyalty to a vanished cause transcended even the knowledge that the war had ended. December 18th, 1974. The humid jungles of Lubang Island fall silent as Lieutenant Onoda Hiroo finally lowers his rifle. For 29 years, 8 months and 15 days after Japan's surrender, the war has finally ended, not with artillery fire, but with a whisper. The psychological toll of such extended isolation would become one of the most profound case studies in military psychology of the 20th century. The reintegration of these holdouts into modern society revealed psychological patterns that stunned medical professionals. Dr. Kazuo Shimizu, who examined several returnees, including Onoda, noted, "These men existed in a psychological time capsule. Their minds remained fixed in 1945 while the world transformed around them." His studies documented a unique form of temporal displacement disorder, where patients struggled to reconcile their perception of reality with actual historical events. For Onoda, the psychological shock was particularly severe. Upon his return to Japan in March 1974, he encountered a nation utterly transformed. Skyscrapers where traditional buildings once stood, television sets in every home, and a society that had largely moved beyond its imperial past. I was disappointed to see Japan had lost its spirit, Onoda later wrote in his autobiography. The Japan he had sacrificed 3 decades to defend no longer existed. The statistics tell a sobering story. Of the estimated 6,000 Japanese soldiers who continued fighting after the war, fewer than 100 survived to be repatriated. According to the Japanese Ministry of Health records, 41% of returned holdouts suffered from severe depression, 67% reported persistent paranoia, and nearly all exhibited symptoms consistent with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. For many, the psychological wounds never fully healed. Private Yokoi Shoichi, discovered hiding in the jungles of Guam in 1972, embodied this struggle. After 28 years in isolation, Yokoi famously declared upon his capture, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." His shame at surrender, even decades after Japan's defeat, reveals the profound depth of indoctrination these soldiers experienced. Within 2 years of his return, Yokoi attempted suicide twice, unable to reconcile his warrior identity with civilian life. Scene Q. An elderly man stands frozen before a neon-lit Tokyo street, his weathered hands trembling as crowds of strangers flow past him like an alien tide. Dr. Robert Lifton, the renowned American psychiatrist who interviewed several holdouts in the 1970s, observed, "These men represent an extreme case of psychological continuity in the face of historical discontinuity. Their minds created elaborate justifications to maintain their worldview despite contradictory evidence." His studies revealed that many holdouts had encountered evidence of Japan's defeat, leaflets, radio broadcasts, newspapers, but dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Perhaps most poignant was the case of Captain Sakai Oba, who led 46 soldiers in guerrilla warfare on Saipan until December 1945. Upon finally surrendering, he discovered that not only had Japan been defeated, but his hometown of Hiroshima had been obliterated by atomic weapons. The cognitive dissonance was so severe that Oba developed selective mutism, not speaking for nearly 3 years after his return. These psychological case studies continue to inform our understanding of how ideology, isolation, and duty can reshape human perception, sometimes with devastating consequences that echo across decades.